There are moments in life when a person looks completely fine on the outside, yet inside their mind something begins to fracture in silence, not with noise or drama, but with a single thought that refuses to leave. In 2019, a 34-year-old man from Ohio named Daniel Carter sat alone in his apartment after returning from work, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Earlier that day, he had smiled at coworkers, answered emails, even laughed during a meeting, but none of it felt real to him anymore. What he didn't understand at the time was that his mind had begun to turn inward against itself, questioning everything he once trusted without giving him permission to stop it. He later described it as waking up inside a life that looked familiar but no longer felt safe to inhabit. And in that space between normal life and internal collapse, his struggle quietly began, long before anyone around him noticed anything was wrong. Daniel's early symptoms were subtle enough that even he dismissed them. It started with questions that seemed harmless at first, like sudden doubts about whether he had locked his door, whether he had said something wrong in a conversation days earlier, or whether people secretly judged him when he wasn't paying attention. Psychological research from institutions such as the American Psychological Association shows that intrusive thoughts can appear in nearly every human mind, but what determines their impact is not their presence, rather the meaning a person attaches to them. In Daniel's case, he began treating every intrusive thought as a warning instead of a mental glitch. That small shift changed everything. Instead of letting the thoughts pass, he began analyzing them, returning to them, and trying to solve them. Over time, his mind became less of a place of rest and more like a courtroom where he was constantly on trial, with no defense strong enough to bring peace. As weeks turned into months, Daniel's inner world became heavier to navigate. He stopped enjoying the things that once felt effortless, like driving at night with music playing or having simple conversations without overthinking every word. His brain started to anticipate danger where there was none, a response tied to the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, which becomes overactive under chronic stress. Even when nothing was happening externally, his body reacted as if something was always about to go wrong. Sleep became fragmented, not because he couldn't sleep, but because his mind refused to stop scanning his life for mistakes. He would replay entire conversations in his head, searching for hidden meanings that were never there. Friends noticed he became quieter, but no one understood that the silence was not peace. It was exhaustion from a mind that never stopped arguing with itself. By the time Daniel realized he needed help, his thoughts no longer felt like passing ideas, but like commands he had to respond to. He began questioning his own identity, wondering if something fundamental inside him had changed. This is where cognitive psychology explains a critical process known as cognitive fusion, where a person becomes so entangled with their thoughts that they begin to believe they are the thoughts themselves. Daniel no longer saw anxiety as something he was experiencing. He saw it as something he was becoming. That shift created fear, and fear reinforced the cycle. The more he resisted the thoughts, the stronger they seemed to grow. It was not that his mind was breaking, but that it was trapped in a loop of self-monitoring that gave every thought too much authority. And in that loop, even ordinary moments began to feel uncertain, as if reality itself could no longer be trusted without internal verification. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Over time, Daniel reached a point where he stopped trying to fight his thoughts entirely, not because he found peace, but because he was mentally exhausted from constant resistance. Psychologists describe this stage as psychological fatigue, where the mind conserves energy by reducing emotional reaction rather than continuing internal conflict. In that quiet surrender, something unexpected happened. The thoughts did not disappear, but they lost their authority. Daniel began to notice a small gap forming between what he thought and how he responded. Instead of reacting instantly, he paused. Instead of believing everything, he questioned gently. This process, known in modern therapy as decentering, allowed him to observe his thoughts without merging with them. It was not a sudden recovery or dramatic transformation, but a gradual return of space inside his mind, where fear no longer filled every corner of his awareness. Daniel Carter did not notice the exact moment things began to shift, because there was no single dramatic turning point, only a gradual change in how his own thoughts started to feel less familiar. He still went to work every morning in Ohio, still answered emails, still nodded during conversations, still laughed when it was expected of him, but inside his mind there was a growing distance between what he was doing and what he was feeling. It started with small interruptions in ordinary moments, like standing in line at a grocery store and suddenly questioning whether he had done something wrong earlier that day without any clear reason, or sitting in traffic and feeling a sudden wave of uncertainty about whether he was truly in control of his own decisions. These thoughts were not loud at first, but they carried a strange emotional weight that made Daniel pause longer than necessary, as if trying to locate where they came from. Psychologists explain that intrusive thoughts often appear without warning and without logic, and research from cognitive behavioral studies shows that the human brain generates thousands of automatic thoughts daily, many of which never reach conscious attention. For most people, these thoughts pass like background noise, but for Daniel Carter, they began to stick. Instead of letting them fade, he started examining them, trying to determine whether they meant something deeper about him. That is where the first real crack formed, not in reality but in interpretation. A simple thought like, "What if something is wrong with you?" stopped being just a passing mental event and started becoming a question he felt obligated to answer. And the more he tried to answer it, the more real it seemed. At home, the changes were even more noticeable in silence. Daniel would sit on his couch after work, staring at the wall or the dim light of his phone screen, replaying small interactions from the day with increasing intensity. A brief pause in conversation with a coworker might suddenly feel like evidence of social failure. A neutral facial expression from someone else might feel like hidden judgment. His mind began to assign meaning where there was none, and each interpretation fed the next wave of doubt. This is closely tied to how the brain's threat detection system works under stress, where the amygdala begins to prioritize possible danger over rational evaluation, even when no real threat exists. Daniel was not losing touch with reality, but his internal alarm system had become overly sensitive, reacting to thoughts as if they were events. The most difficult part for Daniel Carter was not the thoughts themselves, but how convincing they felt when they arrived. A thought like, "What if you are not safe?" would appear during completely normal moments, like brushing his teeth or walking through a parking lot, and instead of dismissing it, his mind would immediately search for proof. He would check his surroundings more carefully, reevaluate past decisions, and mentally scan his body for signs of tension or discomfort. This constant checking created a feedback loop where attention reinforced fear, and fear demanded more attention. Psychological research refers to this as attentional bias, where the brain begins to focus more heavily on information that confirms anxiety, even when that information is harmless or irrelevant. Over time, Daniel's inner dialogue began to change in tone. What once were occasional doubts became frequent internal questions that felt urgent and unresolved. He started waking up in the middle of the night with a sense of unease he could not explain, lying in bed while his mind reviewed situations from days or even weeks earlier. The strange part was that nothing external had changed in his life. No major loss, no clear trauma, no obvious trigger. Only the slow accumulation of unchallenged thoughts that began to shape how he experienced everything around him. Friends and coworkers still saw Daniel Carter as functioning normally, but internally he was beginning to feel like he was observing his own life from a slight distance, as if there was always a layer between him and the present moment. And this is where persistence becomes critical, because once the mind learns that a thought can be returned to, analyzed, and questioned repeatedly, it begins to repeat that pattern automatically. What started as occasional doubt slowly turned into a habit of mental checking, and that habit began to define how Daniel experienced reality itself. As night settled over Ohio, Daniel Carter began to notice that the quiet was no longer calming. It had started to feel active, almost occupied, as though his mind filled the absence of noise with its own internal commentary that grew stronger the longer he stayed still. During the day, he could distract himself with routine, but at night there was nothing left to interrupt the cycle. He would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying thoughts that had followed him since the afternoon. Only now they arrived with more intensity, more certainty, more emotional weight. The phrases "you are not in control" and "something is wrong with you" did not feel like passing thoughts anymore. They felt like statements his mind was presenting as truth, repeated until they lost their sense of origin. Daniel Carter tried at first to argue with these thoughts internally. He would mentally correct them, remind himself that nothing unusual had happened, that he was the same person he had always been, that there was no evidence supporting what his mind was suggesting. But what he did not understand was that anxiety does not respond to logic in the same way it responds to repetition. The more he engaged in mental debate, the more important the thoughts became. In psychological terms, this is where cognitive fusion begins to tighten its grip, when a person stops seeing thoughts as passing mental events and starts experiencing them as reflections of identity. Daniel was no longer simply thinking anxious thoughts. He was beginning to feel defined by them. During the day, Daniel Carter still functioned in a way that looked normal to others, but internally his awareness had changed. He started monitoring himself constantly, noticing his reactions, his tone of voice, his facial expressions, and even the way he felt while observing himself. This self-monitoring created a second layer of awareness that made every moment feel heavier. Instead of living experiences directly, he began analyzing them as they happened. Psychologists describe this state as hyper-reflective thinking, where attention turns inward so frequently that it disrupts natural emotional flow. In Daniel's case, it created a split experience, one part of him trying to live, and another part constantly questioning how he was living. At night, this split became even more pronounced. The thoughts that emerged no longer felt like simple doubts. They began to arrive with emotional certainty, as if they carried authority. "You are not in control" was no longer something he questioned. It was something his body reacted to, tightening his chest, increasing his heartbeat, making him scan his own feelings for signs of danger. "Something is wrong with you" became a lens through which he interpreted everything, from the way he felt waking up to the way he responded to small stressors during the day. Nothing external had changed in Daniel Carter's environment, but internally his brain had started prioritizing threat perception over neutrality, a shift strongly linked to heightened amygdala activity during chronic anxiety states. This is where Daniel Carter's experience deepened into something harder to describe. The boundary between thought and identity began to blur. When a thought repeated often enough, it stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a reflection. And because he was constantly analyzing himself, he had fewer and fewer moments where he simply existed without observation. Even silence became a space where his mind filled in explanations, interpretations, and warnings that felt increasingly personal. The idea that something is wrong did not remain abstract. It started attaching itself to how he saw himself as a person, shaping how he interpreted his emotions, his reactions, even his memory of past events. Psychologists call this process cognitive fusion, where thoughts lose their separateness and merge with identity. But what Daniel Carter experienced went beyond terminology. It felt as though his own mind had become both the source of fear and the evidence for it. The more he tried to understand it, the more present it became. And in that space, where rest should have existed, the shadow of his own thinking began to feel indistinguishable from who he was becoming. By the time morning light began to return to Daniel Carter's apartment in Ohio, something within him had already started to shift in a way he could not fully explain. There was no dramatic realization, no sudden moment of clarity that changed everything at once. Instead, it was quieter than that, almost easy to miss if he had not been paying attention. For the first time in a long while, Daniel noticed that when a thought appeared, there was a brief space before he reacted to it. That space was small, almost fragile, but it was there. And for someone who had spent months feeling completely merged with his thoughts, that space felt unfamiliar, almost like discovering a part of his mind he had forgotten existed. Daniel Carter would later describe it as if his mind had been holding him too close to every thought, not allowing distance, not allowing observation, only immediate belief. But now, something was changing in how those thoughts reached him. When a familiar idea like "something is wrong with you" appeared, it still arrived with emotional weight, but it no longer pulled him in instantly. Instead, there was a moment where he could recognize it as something happening in his mind rather than something defining who he was. In psychological terms, this is what mindfulness-based cognitive therapy refers to as decentering, the ability to step back from internal experiences and observe them without becoming fully absorbed by them. At first, Daniel Carter did not trust this new distance. His instinct was still to analyze every thought that appeared, to test whether it was true or false, dangerous or safe. But slowly, he began to notice that not every thought required a response. Some thoughts arrived and left on their own, without needing to be solved. This realization did not erase his anxiety immediately, but it weakened its authority. The constant pressure to engage with every mental event began to loosen, and in that loosening, Daniel experienced something he had not felt in a long time. Moments of mental quiet that were not forced, but natural. As he started spending more time outside, walking through familiar streets with morning light touching his face, Daniel Carter noticed that his awareness of the present moment was gradually returning. The world around him had not changed, but his relationship with it had. He could hear sounds without immediately attaching meaning to them. He could observe his surroundings without interpreting every detail as a possible sign or warning. The thoughts still came, but they no longer occupied the entire space of his attention. They became part of the background rather than the center of his experience. Psychological research explains this shift as a change in attentional allocation. In earlier stages of anxiety, Daniel's attention had been heavily directed inward, scanning his thoughts for threats and meaning. But as he practiced stepping back, even in small ways, his attention began to redistribute outward again, reconnecting him with the external world. And with that shift, something important happened in his internal experience. The thoughts that once felt dominant began to lose intensity, not because they disappeared, but because they were no longer being continuously reinforced by constant focus. Daniel Carter did not experience sudden healing or complete silence in his mind. The thoughts were still there, still occasionally intrusive, still sometimes uncomfortable. But what changed was their position in his mental landscape. They were no longer at the center of everything. They were no longer directing every reaction or defining every moment. And slowly, through repeated moments of noticing instead of reacting, Daniel began to understand a simple but powerful truth. Attention gives life to thought patterns, and what is no longer constantly fed begins to lose its strength over time. As Daniel Carter stood in an open landscape outside Ohio, the air felt different in a way he could not fully describe. Not because the world had changed, but because his relationship with his own thoughts had changed. For a long time, he had believed the human mind was supposed to feel stable, certain, and consistent, and when it did not, he assumed something in him was breaking. But over time, through everything he had endured internally, Daniel began to understand something far more complex about the mind itself. The human brain is not built for silence. It is built to think continuously, to predict outcomes, to scan for danger, to replay memories, and to imagine possibilities that may never happen. This constant activity is not a flaw, but a survival mechanism. However, when fear becomes the dominant filter through which all thoughts are interpreted, even harmless mental activity can begin to feel threatening. Daniel Carter did not reach a point where his mind became completely quiet, because that was never the goal. Instead, what changed was his relationship with the thoughts that once controlled his attention. He no longer saw them as instructions or warnings that demanded immediate response. When a thought appeared, he could now recognize it as something happening within him, not something defining him. This shift did not happen through force or resistance, but through repeated moments of awareness, where he chose not to engage every thought as though it were an emergency. Over time, this created a new internal rhythm, one where thoughts could come and go without automatically shaping his emotional state. What Daniel Carter learned was not how to defeat his mind, but how to coexist with it. There was no final battle where anxiety disappeared forever, no single moment where fear was erased. Instead, there was a gradual understanding that his mind was not an enemy working against him, nor a master that needed to be obeyed. It was simply a system that produced thoughts, some helpful, some unnecessary, some rooted in fear, and others in imagination. And once he stopped assigning every thought equal authority, the weight he had been carrying for so long began to feel less absolute. Psychologists often describe recovery not as the absence of difficult thoughts, but as the ability to observe them without being controlled by them. Daniel Carter's experience reflected this principle in a deeply human way. The thoughts that once felt like identity began to lose their grip not because they disappeared, but because they were no longer given total control over how he saw himself. He began to notice that even the darkest thoughts were temporary mental events, shaped by emotion, stress, memory, and perception, not permanent truths about who he was. And in that understanding, something quietly powerful emerged. Daniel Carter realized that endurance is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply continuing to live while thoughts attempt to convince you otherwise. Sometimes it is choosing not to believe everything the mind produces. Sometimes it is allowing time to pass while staying present enough to notice that even intense mental states eventually shift. Because the darkest thoughts do not define who a person is. They reveal something deeper about the human condition. The ability to endure internal storms, to question what the mind presents as truth, and to slowly outgrow patterns that once felt permanent. And in Daniel Carter's story, there was no dramatic ending, only a quiet transformation into someone who learned that his thoughts were not commands, not identities, but experiences passing through a mind that was still learning, still adapting, and still human. Not every thought deserves to be believed.